as I was saying, lack of strong political structures. There have been, as I said, several coup d'etat, different juntas took over the power recently. That might have also repercussions in the whole of the West Africa. In ECOWAS, the three states run recently by military juntas, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali have decided to break away with ECOWAS. They have formed an alliance, the so-called Sahel States Alliance. So that will probably, most probably, that they announced that they were leaving. They didn't do, as far as I know, yet. But if they go ahead, they will weaken one of the few supranational structures existing in the region. And then there is, of course, seen from the EU point of view, what is the way ahead? How does the EU has to deal with these governments that came to power through the coup d'etat? The first reaction has been to freeze development cooperation, to freeze the different security programs that were going on in the region. But it has to be seen whether the EU will be focusing again or refocusing the strategy towards the Sahel countries through diplomacy, through the need to engage with these new military juntas or not. There is a big discussion on that in Brussels because, as a matter of fact, the situation in the region is probably worse than ever, worse than in the last decades it has been, and probably the EU will have to engage in a way, in some ways, with this new governments, even though we probably don't like them. But the situation on the ground, in terms of security challenges, in terms of lack of development, of the consequences of climate change, is so pressing and is so difficult that there will need to be, I think, some kind of engagement from the EU with these governments, but also especially with the civil society, because of course civil society should play also a role in trying to get out of this very difficult situation. In any case, I want to thank very much GLOBALCODES, the researchers that did this very good work, these very good studies, also the Gardner University for hosting us, for hosting these events, all the panelists that will participate in this event today, and I hope you can have a look on the report, and I hope this report, I'm sure of it, it will contribute to the discussions that we are having and others will be having in the near future in Brussels on how the EU should rethink its strategy towards this strategic region, also seen from here, from the European Union. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jordi. Thank you very much, Vice Rector, for introducing your words. Also, our Vice Dean for Research, Media and Diaz wanted to be here, and she also expressed, her excuse not to be here. Thank you also, Jordi, for your words and for introducing the context and the process. And thank you for trusting us for this process. Normally, research has something to do with something which is not very visible, which is quite far away from society most of times, that no one really reads what we are doing most of the times. So this is the impression that we have. We know that somehow we are influencing public policies or other like type of speeches or whatsoever. But this particular like initiative it was the first time that GLOBALCODES was engaged in something like this, and it was especially interesting for like many reasons. First of all, because it has like given us the possibility of undertaking a very interesting like research process. We have been for 6-7 months doing this report. First of all, we went to Brussels to interview like people from different like institutions, European External Action Service, international organizations, people from the European Commission, civil society organizations. So this is always like a great opportunity to have like direct intakes about the views of something that has to do with a context that, as you said, is so complex. But also it has been very interesting because it has provided us the opportunity to somehow interact with a European like Parliament group, like the Greens group. We presented this report 1 month ago, 1.5 months ago to the Greens group. And it was very interesting also to see that somehow the different like intakes and ideas that we have developed in this report can somehow influence and shape the way, in this case, the European Parliament might influence like the public policy of such a big and complex institution like the European Union. Because probably one of the aspects that we discovered, and not discovered, but we acknowledge in this report, it was at the end that the European Union is a very complex institution in the sense that it's very difficult, like somehow to shape a policy which does not depend on just like one single actor. It depends on several actors that have like very asymmetric capacity to influence the final output that at the end is understood as the European policy towards the Sahel. So probably one of the things that Javier will also introduce has to do precisely with, at the end, the limited influence that the European Parliament or the European External Action Service have towards the European like Council, which at the end is the institution that has a stronger like influence in shaping the real policy that the European Union somehow develops. So that this is an interesting aspect, because normally we believe that at the end, policies from a big institution like the European Union are very monolithic, but at the end, they are the result of the fragmentation of different voices and different capacities of influencing. So we take like this report as a small like capacity of somehow contributing to this like particular like debate. I think also this report, we were like discussing this at the very beginning, has been made in a context in which everything is changing, especially in the region. We knew that at the end, of course, the region was like dramatically changing, but this last year, especially, I remember that you commissioned this report 1 year ago or so. In July, we had the last coup d'etat in Niger, which frankly probably was like the last shock that the European Union needed to realize that they have completely lost their capacity to influence like the different stakeholders in the region. And this is something that in our interviews was quite noticeable. The fact that members from the European External Action Service, members from the European institutions were really under shock and with like a big question, where to go in the Sahel, what to do in the Sahel in a context in which new stakeholders, probably the most like discussed one has been Russia, but it's not just Russia, everything is changing. And that could be like a good opportunity for the European Union to really rethink like this strategy. That's why we decided to put like this title to this report, a rethink of the US strategy in the Sahel, from problematic policymaking to a new transformative pragmatism. I'm gonna introduce briefly the background of the different European Union strategies. Javier will introduce also the first part of the report, which is an attempt to problematize which are the main problems that the European Union strategies have somehow like presented in these last 10 years. And Lluc will also introduce some of the initial thoughts that could inspire, of course, from our limited capacity, but somehow it was our contribution, the future debate of a kind of future a strategy for the European Union. And we'll give the word to Viviane from Gateway to Africa and Amélie Gauthier from Oxfam, also to help us to reflect on the results of this report. So first of all, just to let you know, the first...
I will follow you from the back.
Thank you so much, Jordi. Thank you so much. So the first part of the report has three parts. The first part tries to assess the three different European Union strategies in 10 years from 2011 on. The second part problematizes these approaches, and the third part tries to depict some ideas for a future or a future European strategy. In this regard, let me introduce very briefly some initial index about the European Union three strategies. As you see, the European Union has developed three main strategies in the last year. 2011, that was the first main strategy. 2015, the regional action plan that was called 2015-2020, and the last European Union strategy was released in 2021. These have been the three main strategies that have shaped the European Union approach in a context in which most of international organizations have developed their own strategies and their own instruments. Russia, the US, of course, the United Nations, of course, other type of stakeholders. So somehow the European Union has coexisted with many other stakeholders that have developed their own instruments in this region. In a context at the same time that paradoxically, since 2011, in which the European Union, and this is not a cause-effect interaction, but it's true that since 2011, the situation of violence has worsened dramatically. The activity of the jihadist group has worsened very much since then. So it has had to coexist with an scenario that has been worsening every year. The three strategies somehow, and this is something that presents the report, are somehow very much shaped by one idea, which is at the end, although the European Union has presented a particular rhetoric, considering that both security and development were important pillars of these strategies, at the end, one critical aspect that the three strategies have showed us is that the European Union has somehow reinforced a very militarized approach. And this has been very problematic because, of course, this has challenged the legitimacy, the credibility, and the sustainability of the strategies somehow. The first strategy, 2011, was very much focused on this balance between development and security. But it was quite clear that that was opening this space for an increasing militarized approach. You have to take into consideration one thing. The first strategy, 2011. The Sahel scenario started changing dramatically in 2012 with the insurgency of the Tuaregs in the northern part of Mali in 2012. That's the turning point for the European Union to start being very concerned about this region. In 2015, it comes the second strategy in which something is brought on board, which is going to be very important from that moment on, which is the issue of migration. Migration starts placing a very relevant place in this report, in something that we have considered that at the end has led also to the European Union to a very problematic issue, which is to securitize, militarize as well, the way migrations are understood and are somehow addressed. Because something that the report tries to highlight is the fact that the way the European Union understands things somehow shapes and influences the type of responses and strategies that are developed. And finally, it's true that 2021 strategy, the third one, is an attempt to somehow recover some aspects that have to do with good governance, with development, but in a context in which the military operations from France, especially, from the US, but also in terms of capacity building of the European Union, are like very clear, like oriented towards security issues and towards the security sector reform. This is 2021 in a context in which coup d'etats in Mali, afterwards in Burkina Faso, and lastly, most recently in Niger started, like somehow challenging the whole of the bulk of the European Union strategy. I will give the word to Javier Rentería, which has been the co-lead of this this research, to introduce a little bit the main findings in terms of problematizing like these strategies. So, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Oscar, and thank you, Jordi, for the opportunity of working on this report. I'll briefly explain the main findings that we have been seeing, and also especially through the conversations with policy officers, law enforcement officers in Brussels with Oscar, how we have perceived, right, the main findings and the key issues that have been affecting the European Union strategy for the last decade or so. And I wanted to highlight four key elements, which are basically that you can see in the screens. I think Oscar explained a little bit about the securitization of three issues that have appeared already, which is the migration, violence, and climate change, which has become quite of an axis of securitization, of constructing the region as an existential threat. And through this securitization, we have also seen how this has affected the operationalization of the EU strategy, and particularly on the programs, which were since the beginning actually really ambitious. It has even said even too ambitious in a way. In the third point, we will speak about a little bit the institutional dynamics and the non-monolithic nature in which Oscar made reference before, and how this has made a very ambitious strategy even more complex. And lastly, but not less importantly, the issue of local ownership and how this has really been neglected in the overall strategy, and particularly with the civil society organizations. Starting firstly, I wanted to speak of this axis that I think we all agree on, which is the climate, violence, and migration axis that has been actually really present throughout the whole strategy and throughout the whole interviews. I think when we were speaking with people in Brussels, they were really concerned about how this nexus or this triple axis was constructed, and particularly problematic we found the violence axis and in relation to the jihadist violence, because we still very much found, and this was also shared by people coming from law enforcement and policy, particularly very focused on the region, that the global war on terror framework and the ideas and concepts are still very much present and are actually reproduced, continue to be reproduced in the Sahel. Particularly the ideas and the counterinsurgency doctrine of the war in Afghanistan, where we saw an overly militarized doctrine of clear and hold approach, in which populations were more or less focused into a garrisoning and into urban centers. So, of course, this works initially, as we saw in Kabul, but it didn't work in the long term. Obviously, this has happened the same in the Sahel, where in a vast rural region with a vast rural population, it's quite impossible to actually deliver this kind of security understanding and of security architecture to a space which is incredibly big. It's double the size of the European Union space. So, in the second aspect was the migration, which is always a very politically sensitive topic. But what we are seeing basically with the issue of migrations is that the EU has focused much more into a route-centric perspective in the issue of migrations that actually does not represent how the real data of migrants coming towards Europe, but represents more the perceptions from Europeans and European policy officers about the issue of migration and what the Sahel means for the whole issue of mobility and migrations, not only from the from the region, but from other regions that use the Sahel as a bridge towards North Africa and of course towards Europe. But the issue is that, and this is never enough to remark it, is that most of the mobility and African migrations are intra-regional and intra-continental. 80% of migrations in Africa are regional and do not leave the continent. So this is extremely problematic, the way we deal with data and perspective. The other issue is it's more close to the issue or to the political framework, which in ECOWAS, we need to understand that ECOWAS is a resemblance of the European Union, or what we were able to reach in this continent after many decades of work. And one of the key aspects of ECOWAS is the free movement of peoples and goods. So at the same time that we were trying to limit this kind of mobility, we are also supporting a regional organization that sponsors this kind of mobility. So in this way, it was quite contradictory to understand the European approach with the regional and also the national approach, because we need to understand that Sahelian countries particularly don't have the same views as we have with the issue of mobility and migration, because it's a historical and part of the socioeconomics of the region. This obviously affected the operational environment, especially of the security sector reform programs, particularly EUCAP and in Niger, where we saw a security sector reform program more focused on governance and the improvement on criminal and police activity turned into a pseudo counter-migration program with the opening of an office in Agadez, in one of what we call the hubs of migration of the desert. And lastly, we have the issue of climate change, which, of course, it's incredibly important, and it's a hot topic and a rising narrative within the whole resilience narrative that we are also, I think, experiencing throughout Europe. But that does not really represent, or is not really does not really take into account the nuances of actually climate change and actual climate variations and what this means for the biomass and the ecological environment of the Sahel. It is true that we've seen, and there are studies, ecological studies around the Lake Chad Basin and certain areas in the Sahel where there's a certain trend of deforestation and desertification, but at the same time, we need to understand that in the broader understanding of the region, there's also a trend of biomass production and regreening. So the issue of climate change is more about how we're starting to use this narrative, which we have seen that it has transformed into a resilience narrative, has turned defensive in the way that it has allowed, or it supports and continues to support policies that are not much concerned about, for instance, one of the key issues, which is land tenure rights and the issue of property of land in the Sahel, but they tend to unite more a defensive stance of the EU with programs on the field related to militarizations of, for instance, park rangers, particularly in the Lake Chad Basin. Following that, and being quite briefly about the institutional dynamics, right, of the European Union. We know it's not a monolithic entity, and this is also what we need to translate for the non-European public. Particularly, we found three main aspects that we wanted to highlight, and one is in the Peace and Security Council, where it has been, I think, quite broad, the critique towards the French posture and the French methods in the Sahel is still very much contested, and the French, it was quite characteristic when we spoke with French officials. They still continue to have quite a hard understanding of the region and quite a realpolitik way of seeing the region, particularly also with the entrance of Russia and with the issue of the Islamic State, particularly. Then the second, let's say, highlight or power asymmetries that we saw within the institutions related to the Sahel were the relationships between the External Action Service and DG INPA, the former DG DEFCO, Development Cooperation, where we saw that two bodies that are supposed to be coordinating and to complement each other in the field. We saw also dynamics of tension and competition between different kind of units. For instance, the units from DG IMPA that were focused on North Africa, for example, did not communicate with units of the External Action Service, particularly focused on the Sahel or in Libya. So this kind of power asymmetries and also the lack of coordination, I think, made, especially in the development side, to be of or to make the development work of the EU, which we need to bear in mind that still is the largest contributor of the region in terms of development. This has made a lot of problematic understandings, mostly at the internal level and in Brussels. And lastly, we had the issue of the dual relationship of Brussels and the delegations in the field and the EU delegations, where I think we have got quite a surprising feedback coming from the EU delegations, where everyone or we saw that delegation actually have a good grasp of what is happening on the ground. They have good knowledge of the realities on the ground, but in the end of the day, member states in Brussels continue to direct policy. So we saw that the relationship between the work in the field and the work in Brussels was a one-way street, where basically the delegations acted as speakers of the policies coming from Brussels. And lastly, the issue of local ownership, which of course is always perceived as a critical part to ensure the sustainability and legitimacy of field building efforts, both by international and local stakeholders. But we'll always get the question of, like, is it really in the works? Like, where do we see it? And we saw that the EU tried to marry a top-down understanding of the issues with a bottom-up approach, also connecting civil society. But at the end of the day, especially given the political difficulties, particularly after the coup d'etats, the EU has tended to follow this top-down strategy, particularly because there was quite a wide understanding that there is a very important weight of military and security sectors in Sahelian countries, particularly because security was and still is, as we see with the military juntas, is considered as a precondition of politics in itself in the Sahel. So in the end, the EU had to more or less limit their action to be pragmatic and to be able to work with the top and the elites of the countries that ended up it has ended up militarizing not only the action but also the politics, and I think we all share this view, given the militarization not only in the Sahel but also in adjacent countries. And without ado, I leave it to Lluc to conclude.
This is the first part of the report, which is an attempt to problematize why the policymaking of the European Union strategy has not been working. And then we have a last part that is going to be introduced by Lluc, that has been assisting the whole report, which is more prospective, and that we have labeled here as transformative pragmatism, which is an idea that you will introduce and somehow tries to inspire somehow ideas for the future in this regard.
Exactly. Thank you, Oscar and Javi, for giving me the word now. So it's very, the next point is very related to what Javi was talking about now, about local ownership and this issue. Since for these broad recommendations or policy guides that we have developed, which are not very specific, are more of a broad conceptualization of what could work in order to improve the European Union strategy. The first one is to promote this critical knowledge production, as stated here. This is important because we come from a theoretical stand that we have done this report from a critical studies, and this mainly states that knowledge is not neutral, instead is subjective, and therefore it matters who produces this knowledge and how this knowledge is produced. If we ignore this, the problem is that we end up with narratives that are quite broad, that understand Africa and the Sahel as one unit, homogeneous unit that is characterized by conflict and by migration and by terrorism and by fundamentalism and so on, and we ignore all the root causes and other dynamics that are crucial. Therefore, we need to adopt this kind of more critical approach, and the way to do this is to rely on the expertise and the knowledge of local actors such as universities and also such as think tanks. In order to do this, we will manage to kind of move away from this Western-centric perspective. And an important risk of taking this kind of approach that was stated by some of the interviewees is that the local actors are very important that they are critical with their own work and with their understanding. If not, we risk that they might adopt kind of an extroversion strategy, so try to use the European Union as an instrument in order to compete in their own internal order. Therefore, by looking at this critical point, that they have this critical perspective, we might be able to overcome these more or less problems. On the other hand, the second broad recommendation is also very related to what Javi was talking about now, is in this kind of triple nexus between security, climate, and migration and mobility. The main recommendation here would be to reshape or to rethink this European approach in the terms of violence and militarization, rethinking how we adopt security sector reform, and also how we rethink the issue of capacity building and governance. As for migration, as Javi told, it is focused on understanding Sahelian migration as a very inherent phenomenon of the region that is very important to sustain livelihood, and therefore important to promote these area-based approaches. And finally, for this kind of more climate crisis kind of reasons, we need to understand that there is a kind of land degradation and land scarcity as well as water scarcity, and therefore this might become resources that people need to compete for. As such, although this is sometimes recognized as an important issue, it is not directly dealt with through these governance measures, and therefore we would put more emphasis in dealing with the rights of the land and access of the population to natural resources to deal with these aspects. And finally, when dealing with this core issue that also gives the title to the report, this transformative pragmatism. To do this, we first need to understand where we are coming from, and we are coming from this notion of kind of principled pragmatism. This means that the European Union has been trying to portray itself as a normative actor, promoting its own values and the international human rights framework. However, disregarding that these values might not be the ones shared by everyone. And therefore, there is a collision that renders a lot of incoherence in European external action when they try to promote these values, but in the same time, you have a very militarized and very securitized approach that adopts quite realist stances and also privileges migration control interests and also security-related issues such as countering terrorism, that although it is very important, it seems that it is also the main factor that seems to inform these European Union strategies. So we need to adopt this kind of more transformative pragmatism that takes out this principle and tries to be more adaptive to the new competitive framework, and that also tries to recognize the role of new actors such as Russia, China, and also non-state and local actors in order to engage them. All in all, the overall objective is that the European Union can have more and broader autonomy, less dependence on its member states, and also more trust in local actors and in their own bodies. As we were saying before, they do have some knowledge and very important knowledge. However, the communications within the same organization tend to be sometimes shaky and not optimal. All in all, this approach is to be a less securitarian, less intrusive, and also more prone to creating some alliances that give the collaboration with the European Union for local and international actors kind of an added value, an extra added value. And with this, we conclude. I will give Oscar back the word.
Thank you so much. This is more or less like the report. I invite you all to read it and comment it and discuss it. But for this exercise, we have also brought two persons that are highly engaged with the region and they have a lot of knowledge. Viviana Gu from Gateway to Africa and Amélie Gauthier from Oxfam. So now it is time for you to give us some feedback, some impressions about the report, and also some personal intakes about the region overall. So the floor is yours. I don't know who wants to start. Vivian?
Okay. Also, first of all, thank you so much, Jordi, for putting this as a priority, because I think that's fundamental. And of course, to Global Codes and Oscar and Javier and Lluc for doing this really good and insightful report. I enjoyed a lot reading it, and it resonated much with the conclusions that I've always had with my own research. Well, you've been explaining this already, but this report reflects on the security strategies of the European Union in the Sahel, and in 2011, 2015, and 2021. And I think that like these years in which the years in which the strategies have been published are not aleatory, but actually also like connect with structural and questions that were happening at the time. So the very first strategy in 2011 is published when the Gaddafis, well, when the king of the war in Libya. So the European Union was already worried about what was going to be the situation in the region, in the Sahel region, because one of the things that the African Union said when Europe was and the United States were thinking about intervening in Libya was, do not do that because you're gonna destabilize Africa, right? And that's what happened. Then in 2015, the Algiers Accords were signed, so the peace agreements for Mali after the insurgency. And it was a moment in which the Serval operation, which was the first military operation of France in Mali, was claimed to be very successful. But right after signing the accords, the violence and terrorist attacks increased dramatically. And then we find the third one in 2021, when technically the Takuba operation, which was the last attempt of the European, of France, but bringing in other partners from the European Union to address it like from another perspective. But the task force, the Takuba task force, could not be completely could not have like complete operability, and that there was like the successive coup d'etat that you have seen already. There is such a pattern, right? Two successive coup d'etats with anti-colonial claims and popular support. And now we are here. We are here with this report, and I guess that this is happening in 2024. So after after a key moment happened and not before or just in, it could be optimistic. Like it makes me optimistic because it means that this report will serve for the next EU strategy. The report reflects on the four main points, and I'm going to try to go through them very briefly. I'm going to start with the securitization and the EU strategies, pointing out, as you state, that the global war against terror has affected the analysis of the very complex realities happening in the Sahel. So when you analyze it from a very securitarian and an enemy perspective, you are losing the capacity, or people can lose the capacity to understand the very personal problematics that are behind the people that radicalize. And that's fundamental to address and to avoid radicalization itself. This was one of the ways in which these socioeconomic and political factors were neglected, and probably was behind how this strategy accelerated the radicalization of new people, and facilitated the recruitment by the militant Islamist groups. And I always see this as a vicious cycle of violence. So if you have radicalized people and you don't address the local factors, these people will radicalize more. So it's normal that the tendency has been increasing if what we are investing is much more military resources every time. I also want to welcome the inclusion of the ecological and mobility perspective. These are key factors, and particularly because there are two main strategies in front of climate-related shocks: adaptation or migration. And if you don't have any of them available, conflict seems very easy to begin, right? So having this lens can and really including this lens in the next strategy will be very positive. Also, I think that the different strategies fail to, as you also point in the report, to understand the nomadic nature of the Sahelian communities, and particularly in northern Mali, northern Niger, and northern Chad. And at the same time that you are externalizing your borders and limiting and transforming the way these people live, do their economics, their business, etc. So this is also catalysis for migration, right? There was a particular comment in the report I really enjoyed, because you wrote about how Chad is today considered one of the countries with less space for political participation, but also for access to rights. But at the same time, is the country less looked by the European Union. It has somehow, it's never on the loop. It's never criticized, and well, this is an incoherence that should be addressed. Then relating to the institutional dynamics and the local ownership, I found really interesting how you address how you point out that the effects of the unfinished integration process of the European Union, because at the end all these limitations, it's because the European Union structure is not yet finished and it's not working smoothly as it should. So how this unfinished integration is affecting the capacity to launch a coherent strategy, and this is something that is really important to discuss right before the opening of a new policy cycle. Maybe this should be another priority for this EU policy cycle. And you signal concretely the fragmentation between DG INPA and the EEAS, and I want to quote you. You say that these institutional challenges are a growing obstacle to international peace and security operations, in particular because of their intrusive nature, top-down approach, and a lack of local ownership and participation in strategy formulation and implementation. And I welcome that you wrote this, because otherwise it will be more uncomfortable for me to point out that maybe the EU does not only need to reassess how it works, but also to look at neocolonial practices that might be influencing also the outcomes of these strategies. Because directing the future of a country from another country's bureau reminds me of an era that we should have left behind already, and that doesn't seem to have finished yet. And I believe that this is particularly one of the factors that permit these military juntas to claim, to evoke the rhetoric of anti-coloniality while increasing the death toll in the fight against insurgents. Because it's true, these military juntas are not being able to reduce the casualties and the pain of the peoples of their country, but at the same time, the fact that there are so gray areas in EU-Africa relations also give them this capacity to mobilize the population and sustain themselves with their or part of their support. So I think that you're very much appropriate in reflecting about the gap also about between the local ownership rhetoric and its practice, and signaling the contradictions in the 2020 EU strategy, in which were not identified nor negotiated the interest of the local populations. And this point makes me to return to the question of migration. because you also point this that, externalization of borders is a very violent process, right? And it is not within the interest of the peoples of the Sahel. And the governments of the Sahel should be representing the interest of their people, so not welcoming this violent externalization of border practices. So while there is a focus on the need of reinforced governance, and you said this exactly, that the social contract between the peoples and the governments are being broken. So this is a question we need to reflect. Reading this report, like a lot of ideas like came to my mind on which is the impact that actually borders control is having in the same radicalization process, and are we not maybe creating, but are we fueling are we fueling are we fueling the challenges, the security threats we are afraid of, just by trying to protect ourselves from them? I don't know if it makes sense. But going to the end, and regarding the conclusion, so you need you signal the need to put local universities and think tanks at the forefront of the strategy. I really appreciate you wrote that, because I think it's not only a scientific need, but it's also a political demand of the Global South organized movements and intellectuals. You also propose to reshape the core aspects of the EU strategies, particularly the securitization framework within the security development framework. And I quote you again when you state that if governance is to be central for peace in the Sahel, assistance on governance should have a strong emphasis on land rights and safe access to natural resources, not security. And I think that this is exactly the point. In this sentence, you synthesize broad research on intercommunal violence. Why is people fighting each other? Why is people radicalizing? Because they do not have human security, because they can not maintain their agricultural crops production. Like they are suffering, and here is where the question emerges of who provides security. And if the answer is the government, then people will support the government. But if the answer are insurgents or Catholic groups, they are going to be their preference, because people might not be making decisions on ideological, you also point this, motivation all the time, but maybe on your own survival. And finally, I found particularly interesting the notion of transformative pragmatism and how to reconcile an EU values-based approach with increasing geopolitical tensions and the need to disarticulate the violent groups. And this took me back to the introduction when you mentioned the question of strategic polygamy, on what I understand that is the changing foreign and internal policy priorities of African states, and gave me a lot of questions. So technically, as a discussion, I should be criticizing you. I generally criticize people, but this report was so amazing, I could not forget. So endorsing the report, I want to finish with 3 questions. The first one is, I already said it, to what extent the violence practices of border externalization contribute to radicalization. The second one is, to what extent the EU has any type of capacity to influence to what is happening in the Sahel. The Sahel is almost as big as the EU itself. Isn't it maybe believing too much of ourselves that we can control, or that we have to support what their governments strategize to survive? Because at the end, these governments, these states want to survive, which is a really rational and realistic objective. So maybe they might already have some clues. And here takes me to the third question, and is, can we find solutions in the foreign policy shift? So if we analyze what these governments are asking to the new geopolitical actor, what they are negotiating, what we are criticizing they are negotiating, maybe we find there some of the needs that might reconduct the situation. These are just some thoughts, but thank you so much.
Thank you, Vivian. Let's finish with Amélie Gautier's comments from Oxfam. I have to say that Oxfam has been a very critical actor in this process, in the whole process. Oxfam was one of the actors that was interviewed in Brussels. We have been also in contact with people in the field. Oxfam participated also in the seminar that we held here in Barcelona in November, hosted by CDOP. Thank you also to Stefan here from Oxfam, who is also attending the session. We also appreciate. So for us, Oxfam has been a very critical role because you have a long presence in the region, have a lot of knowledge and a very interesting and particular approach to the region. So it will be especially interesting also to listen what Amélie Gautier has to say about the report. So the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much. I hope I can live up to all of that hype because I'm just one person and Oxfam is really big and we have a lot of collective knowledge, So I tried to gather this and bring this today. And I would like to start by thanking Jordi Solé for asking for this, really important piece of work. I think it's important that we are accountable, like the European Union to be a bit more accountable with the strategy, with the resources that it invests externally and see exactly what are the results. And I think this is a good process and we should take note and it should inform the next political cycle or, a policy cycle. Thank you very much to the university. I also really enjoyed the document, so thank you so much. I really like the analytical framework that you used. I think the review of the 3 strategies were particularly important. It was really well done. So congratulations on that. It was a really nice read, even for somebody who, like me, reads a lot of documents, reads a lot of papers on the Sahel. So that was really good. So I don't want to go into so much detail about looking at the different sections, but I'm going to frame my intervention around 4 points, which I'm going to try to bring some light or shed light on some of the things that we from Oxfam would think would be really important to add. This is around governance, and I know that all of the things that I'm going to mention, some of them you do talk about, so it's not a question of, some of them is going deeper into those aspects, and some of them are a bit new. So governance, participation of civil society, I have a few things to say about that. Humanitarian diplomacy, it's not there, so this is something I would also add, and maybe talk about decolonialism, so a decolonial approach as a maybe our contrast around the transformative pragmatism. So to start off, I think that the EU with their strategy focused on military, there was an interest to make it short, to make a quick intervention, a little bit like what they did in Afghanistan, like you were saying, let's let military not get involved with the politics. And I think that was a shortcut that became a very long detour because the situation has deteriorated so much. So this focus on a military or a very securitized approach has been a failure. We have seen it over the years. The number of armed group has increased. The number of security incidents has increased. The number of victims of the conflict has increased. This protection of the population has increased. So there's a lot of indicators there that show that a purely military approach to much more complex problems, human, social, as you said, human, social, political, is not a good policy at the end. I think, the EU, and I have read this in other reports, has basically, been hands off the governance because it's just too complex. So we don't want to get involved in something that is messy. We prefer to be out. And I think that's a real cost that has not been accounted for. We have been calling to look at, more of the root causes of the crisis. What are the root causes of the crisis, of the inequality crisis, of the climate crisis, of the humanitarian crisis, and of the security crisis? And there's no, profound analysis, and that goes a little bit back to like we need to have this local knowledge production, and it's true. Like when we do projects and we have local, like community, local level conflict analysis, we do good programming. We're making a difference where that is. So we need to have that knowledge on root causes, and we also need to ensure that we support local organization and local peace initiative. They work, the communities know, they trust leaders, they trust existing mechanisms, and we need to strengthen that, and that was not sufficiently done. I think another aspect it's not talked about, and I understand that this is not the EU, but all of the state of emergency decrees in the Sahel countries has been had perverse effects on youth, on liberties, on sustainable livelihood. So this is also something that, while it's not something from the EU, this is something that the EU or the delegations in the country might want to address. We need to have this knowledge, we need to analyze the situation. It has been very detrimental, and the EU can continue to have this conversation. My second point is enough rhetoric about civil society participation. So I think somebody in this conversation were a bit disappointed that the civil society organization only appear 8 times in the report. So we would like it for it to appear more. The civil society organizations are so important in the Sahel. We have been working with them in various sectors. They play a crucial role in democracy and social justice and protection of rights. So I think the EU needs to make more effort to ensure that there's a real and meaningful engagement with the civil society. The Emanuela Del Rey and Josep Borrell, say it again and again, but it doesn't translate into concrete actions where we actually see civil society organizations really being part of spaces, of political process, of policy processes, of consultations. So we want to see more of that. They have a more nuanced, goes back to the knowledge, they have a more nuanced understanding of the realities. They have a better understanding of what is needed, what are the priorities, and where change can happen. So when we talk about the local ownership in the document, that's really good. But I think the local participation needs to come before the ownership, because if there's no participation, there's no ownership. One of the critical areas that we are very preoccupied about is the defense of human rights defenders. They have, I think, in this closed civil space, there is arbitrary detentions, there are disappearance, there is, I was actually talking about, we were talking about these media outlets that have been suspended. So this is an area for me where in its relations, external relations with these countries, that needs to be part of the agenda. There's some points that need to continue, because yes, like what is the balance between pragmatism and values? And I think that there are some values that you can't drop. You can't throw it away. It's part of us. It's part of that relation that we should have with countries. And I think that defending human rights defenders is part of that relation. And just to add, that on the local production aspect, I think it's very important. I think that's a great idea. I think I'm with Vivian. I think it's needed. It's important. But I would also not limit to academia or think tanks, because in the same way that you analyze that entities are not monolithic, I think that there is this also this bubble in the capitals of countries, or especially Sahel countries, and think tanks and universities are part of an elite, right? So I think you need to make sure that this goes beyond the capital to better understand what is happening in the areas, in the faraway, isolated, abandoned areas, because this is where the security problems are happening. Okay. There is one non-negotiable European value, is the preservation of human life. And for me, the European Union needs to have a humanitarian diplomacy strategy to denounce the violation of international humanitarian law. The number of victims, as I said, that are victims of the conflict have increased so much. The number of armed groups have increased so much. We have problems of access, all types of problems of access to reach the population. And Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, there is suspension of programs. Obstacles go from lately in Niger. Niger is asking humanitarian organizations to pay military escorts. They are obliging us to have military escorts, and they are obliging us to pay the military escorts to these vulnerable communities. So this is something that needs to appear in the humanitarian diplomacy agenda. And this channel needs to continue to be open, because this is about preserving human life in these faraway areas to reach. This is happening in Niger. In Mali, we need to inform and sign reports every month with a local authority that does not exist. So we need to go around and find somebody who can sign the report to continue to operate in these areas. So this is another access problem. And this is all kinds of administrative impediments and security impediments that make it very difficult for us to implement our programs. I think that there is space for more humanitarian diplomatic action at the global level, at the regional level, at the African level. So I really hope that this is something that is not negotiable for the EU in its external relation, and I really hope that this is a channel that the EU can continue to maintain, insist upon respect of international humanitarian law. And also I would like to add that Spain has a very good humanitarian diplomacy strategy. And I have to admit, I really like it. I think it's very clear, I think it's very to the point, and this could be a basis, for example, for the rest of the EU in case. My last comment is about this transformative pragmatism. I have to admit, I also like the idea of transformative pragmatism. But I also would suggest another concept, which is the decolonial approach. I think that there needs to be humility in the relationship that we have with the Sahel. And I think that this is what the tables have turned. The EU countries do have a lot of negotiating power. So I think that we need to be humility in recognizing that. And I think that there is space for the EU to improve, like you said, its coherence, its unity, and how they approach different countries and regional and international organizations. We need to recognize other powers that are also having a massive influence in the region. And I suggested, having a close colonial period or legacy to open a new relation, like a newer relationship with more respect and more equilibrium in it. So I'm going to stop there. So yes.
Thank you so much, Amelie. We don't want to make this very long, but let's open the floor for, I don't know, questions or comments, maybe from the audience, 2 or 3. Then we will be back here for very short reactions, and then we will hear the word to close down a little bit. I don't know, words or comments, questions? Yeah, if you want to introduce yourself a little bit or briefly or...
Okay, my name is Jordi Solé. I'm a member of the Oscar Mateos sectorial committee for EU and international policy. When you talk about development, I think there's an elephant in the room, or one of the elephants anyway, which is, of course, economic development. And referring to the colonization of the Sahel, the extractive industries, which are huge and are run by, amongst others, European businesses, European corporations. And I think that there are massive, one of the resources that's been touched upon is wood, some tropical wood, charcoal, things like that, when you were referring to the climate problem. But of course, we have uranium, cobalt, diamonds. There are masses of extractive resources there, which are exploited by us. I think that would be very important to take into account in how we might help in the development, because they are very big businesses, and very little of the transformative industry takes place, or none at all takes place in Sahel. That would also be a grain of sand in the issue of solving the migration problem. In that if you're developing industry, transformative industry of these raw materials, you'll have further economic activity around that industry. So I think that is something extremely important. And I just looked, I haven't read it, so I don't know whether you mentioned that at all.
Thank you so much. More questions or comments from the audience? Something you want to raise? No? If not, I don't know, Javi, Lluc, you want to react to something that maybe they raised? Very briefly. Huh?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I wanted to react to Amélie's comments regarding the humanitarian diplomacy. I think it's one of the missing bits of the report, for sure. I think we all agreed when we were working on it, and the difficulty to include it, right? I think we just saw last week Human Rights Watch denounced like a massive killing in Burkina of more than 200 people, and they were directly or automatically expelled, and also with BOA and the BBC. It's definitely a challenge. I mean, it needs to be part of the European, definitely of the European external diplomacy, but for me, it's also in this very realpolitik, a very hard commission, a very pragmatic commission. It was one of the missing bits that we saw throughout the whole process. Also, during the coup with Niger, we were basically there after literally some months after the coup happened, and also after the first months of the third strategy, and they were still lost on the reaction. And humanitarian action was one of the key topics. Should we maintain? We're cutting budget support, but should we maintain the humanitarian support? So in this sense, that's what you said, right? Again, of the cutting funds, but because we are defending human rights, but at the same time, the problem of losing for the connections at all, I think, and also connecting a bit with what you said. It's really easy. Also, I think we saw that there is a rise in pragmatism, not only in the Sahel, but in Africa in general, because the Global South and the voice of the Global South is rising, and also in terms of the importance in general, like in international forums like the General Assembly, where we saw in Ukraine, every country of European country trying to convince African countries to support Ukraine. But then we have this, within this humanitarian diplomacy, we see other actors, for example, Turkey or Morocco, which are also getting into a religious diplomacy. They're working with these softer tools. And I think in the EU, we need to try to also learn these kind of tools. I think we're still stuck in very much a traditional way of doing diplomacy, which is the politics and the high states and the big meetings and the forums and the post-summits and all of that. But we see countries that are working on this issue through different ways. I think that should be one one way of trying to find humanitarian action in fields that don't look humanitarian. For example, I think in regards to the exploitation and the extractive industries, last week Niger signed a cooperation agreement with Iran in terms of who is going to exploit now the uranium, and they're going to help build actual extractive and conversion of uranium plants in Niger. The same is happening in Mauritania with China, who is helping build infrastructure basically without political cost or without any cost. So I think we need to also transform the way we relate with African countries in a partner way. We need to create actual 50-50 partnership. We cannot continue having these clientelist networks where we see that development aid, humanitarian aid, and security aid is always dependent on something, on a condition that the EU puts. So in this sense, I think we need one of the key aspects, and I think we were not able to include it here, was the need to rethink the analysis of like how the EU does the analysis on the ground, and what are our tools and what are our performance indicators, because they're still much quantitatively driven, very focused on, we train, for example, we train 20 officers, but we don't know what are they doing. There's no follow-up, there's no service. So I think we just need to, there are still a lot of work to do, especially in the field of, in the internal processes of the EU, and particularly to include the civil society. One of the problems that one organization in the EU told us that was very much involved in the construction and in the financing of projects made locally was the bureaucratic problem. One of the biggest problems was for local organizations delve into the bureaucracy or the sea of bureaucracy that involves many or trying to apply for a project. So the EU needs to, mostly through the delegations, I think one of the key aspects would be to simplify all of these processes. I think that's a key aspect.
You want to raise something?
Yeah, I thank you, Emily, also for pointing out this issue of the colonial approach, because I think we do try to approach it a little bit with this transformative pragmatism that does want to deal with the historical legacies, which are undeniable. For instance, we cannot understand today's protest in all those Sahel against French troops without recognizing all the historical legacies and all of French colonialism and how we as Europeans understand that region since the construction of our identity and their identity from this colonial period. And I do think that we should have given a little bit more of importance. So it's important to point that out. And I think that would be it for me as well.
Thank you so much, really, for your comments. I think there are two aspects that somehow both of you have highlighted. One has to do with the role of the local in producing knowledge, and it's true, and I agree with you that this more community-based approach is there. There are increasing reports from institutions like the Rift Valley Institute in the Horn of Africa, in which they are working with local communities as producers of knowledge and conflict analysis tools. And this, I agree that this particular aspect could be much more developed, because probably it's much more critical in producing the way problems are understood and the type of solution, much more transformative, could be provided. And the other thing that both of you have commented has to do with this idea that the tables have turned. Has the European Union understood this? Has the capacity to somehow reshape and rethink the approach to a region like the Sahel, in the sense that we mentioned something here that we thought was important, which is added value, which is the added value that the European Union is somehow ready to start thinking about, which is a different approach that maybe other actors, stakeholders at this particular moment are providing to this, and another value that can provide more legitimacy and that can contribute much more importantly to sustainable kind of transformative solutions. I think this is something that probably, and I connect here with Jordi, to see, and to realize to what extent this type of analysis of reflections from the European Parliament are able to somehow scale up to the Commission, to the Council, in order to reflect a deep rethink of the European strategy. Let's finish, Jordi. I don't know if you want also to say something to close like the session or.
Well, I just want to say that I enjoy very much this this dialogue that we had around this report, all of your interventions. Maybe as a way of closing this event and going back to one of the questions that you might put at the end of her intervention. I think one of your questions was how far is it legitimate for the EU to try to influence on the ground of things going on in these countries? Well, I think it is legitimate as long as you try to do some positive things on these countries, because at the end of the day we have a responsibility as Europeans to the situation, the current situation in Africa in many senses, in many dimensions. At the same time, I think it was Javier who mentioned that we are still the biggest donors in terms of development cooperation. So I think we have to have a positive influence because of the legacies that we left as colonial powers, because of the need to help as much as we can the civil society, the governments, to improve the situation, working together with local stakeholders. But also, and as a third reason to do that is that if we don't do that, there are others doing that. And I'm thinking of Russia, I'm thinking of China, and they don't look at all for any kind of accountability in terms of fundamental rights, in terms of where the money is going, what do they get in return. So I think there are plenty of reasons to say the EU has to have a coherent strategy, trying to be as much principled, as much pragmatic. That's one of the things that always came into our debates in the Foreign Affairs Committee when we had someone from the EAS commenting on any kind of foreign affairs policy from the EU. We always complain from the side of the Parliament that sometimes, or quite often, the EU is not as coherent as we should be, and we sometimes, most often, we forget about the principles that we take for granted inside the European Union when it regards to the rest of the world. But if you try to influence regions of the world that you think are strategic for you and for these people living on the ground, for these communities, again, talking about one of the poorest regions in the world, we have to have a responsibility, and we have to act in order to win legitimacy, because the EU has lost legitimacy in the region. I remember we had a public hearing in the Foreign Affairs Committee. I think it was in January, and one of the panelists, I think he was speaking from Dakar as member of a Western African think tank, and he said, for the people in the Sahel, the European Union is France, and the European Union is the colonial legacy that mostly French left in this part of the world, and it's true. The European Union is much more than one country. It's 27 member states trying to act, and they have to act in unanimity when taking decisions on foreign affairs. But there is a legacy, there is a history behind, and I very much agree with this need to decolonize the external policy from the European Union. So I hope for the next policy cycle, for the next mandate in the European Parliament, these debates can be somehow restarted and focusing on the Sahel. The current strategy was adopted in 2021. As it has been said, many things just in 3 years have changed a lot in the region. So there will have to be another strategy, and I hope many of the points of the main arguments and suggestions from this report, from this document, could be taken into account to have a much more efficient and much more, let's say, aligned with this principle of pragmatism for the EU's policy approach towards the Sahel for the next years. So thanks very much. I think the collaboration, by the way, and that's my last comment, between policymakers and the academia, researchers, think tanks, NGOs is of utmost importance. We have the possibility to do that in the European Parliament. As MEPs, we can commission this kind of reports, and I wish that in all the parliaments that could be so easy, because I think, having a good basis, good knowledge, also good theoretical approach to the realities in the world is absolutely key to have good policies. So I think this exercise that we have done with this report is a positive one, and I only wish it could be done more often and probably with a bigger intensity from other parliaments. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I think we'll leave it here. Thanks so much.
Muy bé, nens. Us heu fet foto de grup?
Voleu fer una foto de grup? I tant.
Què tal, us agrada? No va part del grup, però sí, ara faig una foto.